Okay, so yesterday you heard about Gladys as the foot inspector, where she would go around to all the villages and she would make sure the little girls' feet were unwrapped. And Gladys had so much success in this job that people respected her. And all different kinds of people were asking her for help. And so she had to kind of go do the most outrageous jobs. And one of those jobs is she had to stop a prison riot. Do we know what a riot is? Right? It's like where everybody's fighting and killing each other. Yeah, so one day Gladys is minding her business at the inn. She's making something to eat. And a messenger says, "Gladys, you are needed at the prison. You have to come right now." And so she's like, "What? I've never been to the prison." He said, "Come now, the warden needs you." So as she gets closer to the prison, she can hear from outside. Inside, all of the men are screaming, fighting. She hears it. She's getting scared. And finally, the warden, he spots her. And he says, "Gladys, I've been waiting for you. You have to go inside the prison. The men are killing each other, and I need you to stop the riot." And she looks at him. She's like, "Excuse me, I don't know what to do. That's not a thing I do." And he says, "Yes, you go in and stop the." She says, "If I go in, I will be killed." And he looks at her. He says, "Oh, no, you will not be killed." And she's like, "Yes, I will." He said, "No, you will not, because you are a Christian, and you keep telling everyone that you have the living God inside of you. So if you have the living God inside of you, you cannot be killed. So you and God go in the prison and stop the riot." And she's like, "I don't know what to say to this man, because that is not correct." She knew she did have this Holy Spirit inside her, and she knew that God could protect her, but she could absolutely 100% be killed. So she thinks about it for a minute, and she thinks, okay, if I don't go in, the men are going to die. And also, people are going to start thinking that I'm a liar. They're going to start thinking that my God is actually powerless. So she realizes she has to go in. And so she tells the warden, she's like, "Okay, I'll go in." And he's like, "Great." And he pushes her into the prison. And she has to go down this really long, dark hallway. And the whole way she's just praying, "God, protect me, give me wisdom, help me stop this riot." And so she gets into the prison yard, and there's blood everywhere. There's men lying in heaps. They're just dead. There's a man across the yard. He's got a machete, which is a giant, long sword. He turns, he raises the machete, and runs straight at Gladys. And she's standing there, and she doesn't know what to do, and he's getting closer and closer, and all of a sudden she just yells, "Stop at once and drop your machete!" And he does. He instantly drops it. It clangs to the ground, and all the prisoners stop what they're doing, and they are silent. And they turn, and they look at Gladys, and she just keeps yelling orders. She's like, "I'm here to help you, but I'm not going to help you until you clean up this mess." And so she's like, "Clean it up, come stand in a line, and then we'll talk." And you know what the prisoners did? They cleaned up the mess. They started taking dead bodies out. They picked up all their weapons. And then they started talking to Gladys. And they said, "Gladys, look, we don't have any food in here. We barely have any clothes. All we do is sit around all day and wait to die." And so Gladys was very sad. And so she thought, these men need things to do. They have to work with their hands, because if they don't, they're just going to end up killing each other. And so she talks to the warden, and she tells him, "You need to give these men jobs." And he does. So the men start making their own clothes. They start growing their own food. And within months of the riot, the prison is transformed. And everybody hears about it. And they start calling Gladys a nickname. Now, do you remember yesterday when Gladys got to China? Did the people love her? No, remember they threw rocks at her, and they would even call her foreign devil. But now, the people loved Gladys. And they started calling her Iwida, which means virtuous one. And this was a sign of love that they had for Gladys. Now, after this, Gladys got to do another job. So we've seen her be an innkeeper. We've seen her be a foot inspector. We've seen her be a prison guard. And now she gets to be a mother. And so here's a picture of Gladys. She's surrounded by lots of Chinese people, but particularly Chinese children. And there were so many children that would come to the inn and need care that eventually Gladys was able to adopt 5 of them. So she became a mother to 5 Chinese children. And she wanted to make sure that she was never separated from these children. Because remember, she's not Chinese. She's from where? London, right? But her children were Chinese. So Gladys became the first ever foreign missionary to ever become a Chinese citizen. So she thought, if I'm a Chinese citizen, my children will never be separated from me because we're from different countries. And so Gladys adopts these children. She keeps doing her ministry at the inn. But as the muleteers are coming through the inn, they start talking about war. And they start talking about this great enemy. And they talk about Japan and the Japanese. And they're saying that the Japanese are going to start moving into China. And so people are getting afraid. They're getting frightened. But here in Yangchang, this is where Gladys is, they're not really worried. They're like, we live in the mountains. They're not going to get to us. We'll be fine. But they were wrong. One day in the spring, out of nowhere, Japanese planes fly over Yangchang and drop bombs on the city. And it destroys a lot of the city. And Gladys knows it is not safe for them to stay there anymore. So she has her 5 children, and she's got people that are staying at the inn, and she realizes we need to get out of Yangchang. And so because of her travels throughout the region, she knew of a mountain village that was surrounded by caves. And she thought, if we can get to the caves, we will be safe, we will be hidden, and the Japanese will not be able to find us. So she takes about 40 people up the mountain, and they settle in these caves. But after a while, Gladys realizes, we're going to run out of supplies. We're going to need some more bandages. We're going to need some more food. So she realizes, I have to go back to Yangchang to get some supplies. So one day she does. She creeps down the mountain. She's not seen by any of the Japanese. And she gets to Yangchang. And she is so sad because there's rubble everywhere. The city is mostly destroyed. She goes to the inn and she's digging around trying to find stuff that she can take back up to the caves. And she finds a tiny little card that she had written Mrs. Lawson. And on the card it says, I can do all things through God who gives me strength. And Gladys is so encouraged, and so she puts the card in her pocket, and then she hears pop, 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 pop. And she gets to the ground, and then she hears yelling. And she realizes, oh no, there are soldiers here. And so she has to get out of the inn, so she runs for the city gate. And as she's running, bullets are whizzing by her head. She's looking around, and she realizes the Chinese soldiers are on the top of the wall, but they are shooting at the Japanese soldiers who are outside the city. So Gladys is stuck. She has to get outside the city, but if she runs out through the gate, she's going to run right into the Japanese. So she kind of crouches behind the wall, and she looks out, and she spies a wheat field. And remember, Gladys is a tiny woman, so she thinks, okay, if I can make it to the field, I will jump into the wheat. And the wheat is high enough to cover me, and I can just crawl my way out of the city. But she has to wait for the right moment. So she's waiting behind the wall, and all of a sudden she sees the Chinese, and they open a hand grenade, and they toss the hand grenade at the Japanese. There's a huge explosion, and Gladys runs as fast as she can, and she dives into the wheat, and she's on her hands and her elbows, and she's going, and she's going, and she's going, and she escapes. And she makes it back up to the caves. But once she gets there, she says, look, guys, we cannot go back to Yangchang. There are soldiers there. There is fighting still going on. We're going to have to stay in these caves for a while. So they do. And about 150 people make their way from other villages up to these caves. And Aida, she takes care of them, and she gives them food, and she bandages their wounds. But she also has to keep going back to Yangchang. And on one of these trips back, she sees her friend, the Mandarin. Do you remember the Mandarin from yesterday? He was like that fancy man that rode around in a carriage, kind of. So her and the Mandarin were friends. And on one of these trips back, he tells her, he says, look, Gladys, the Japanese are coming. And so we have to do what's called a scorched earth policy. So that means we're going to have to destroy everything in the town that's not already destroyed. So if there is crops, we're going to have to burn them. If there are animals, we're going to have to kill them. If there are buildings with roofs still on them, we're going to have to take the roofs off. Because if there is no place for the Japanese to stay, they will just move through our town onto the next. And so Gladys is heartbroken. She doesn't want her whole town destroyed, but she agrees that this is the safest thing for the people of Yangcheng. So she decides to help the Mandarin demolish what is left of the city. And then before her and the Mandarin leave Yangcheng, he invites her to dinner, and he says, Gladys, I have something so important to tell you. And so she goes to his house for dinner, and he says, Gladys, I have been watching you, and I have seen all that you do, and I want to become a Christian just like you. And Gladys is stunned. She's been friends with this man for 10 years, and he has watched her be obedient to God. He has watched her faithfully serve all the people of the village, and now he's asking to become a Christian. And so Gladys is overjoyed, and she prays with him, and then they say their goodbyes. And this is the last time that Gladys will ever see her friend the Mandarin, because before the war is over, he gets killed by the Japanese. So Gladys eventually leaves and goes back to the caves. But after several months, she hears that the Japanese have left the region, and it's finally safe for everyone to go back to the city. So she takes about 150 people back to the city, and they start rebuilding everything. So she rebuilds the inn. They rebuild the schools. So if you go there today, you can see the Inn of Eight Happinesses. It's still standing. And Gladys gets back to her ministry. So she keeps going on foot inspection tours. She keeps taking care of children. In fact, there are so many children that have been orphaned by the war that she's got hundreds of them now that stay at her inn. And because there's no Mandarin to kind of be the official over the city, there's a Chinese army general put in that position instead. And he starts talking to Gladys, and he starts asking her questions about her ministry and why she works so hard and how is she possibly taking care of all these children. And she's like, I have no idea. I just know that God keeps providing. And so he tells her, look, Gladys, I have heard about these orphanages that have been built 200 miles away. And I am sure that if you can get those kids to those orphanages, they will have room for them, and then you won't have to care for so many here. And so Gladys makes a plan. She and a friend are going to take about 200 kids 200 miles over the mountains, cross a river, and they're going to get them to these orphanages. So the plan was her one friend is going to take 100 kids first. So she gets them all ready and prepared and sends him off. Okay, and so he takes them up over the mountains. He crosses, this is called the Yellow River, and he gets those kids safely to the orphanages. So those kids are safe. They're out of the war zone. But on his way back to get Gladys and the other 100 kids, he gets killed. So Gladys is just in Yangcheng waiting for her friend to come back. And she's waiting. She doesn't know where he is. But while she's waiting, something else happens. Almost instantly, overnight, Gladys becomes world famous. So a few months prior, an American journalist had come to China to meet Aida. He wanted to ask her all the questions about the war, about the children, so she gave him an interview. And then he went back to America, and this interview was published in a magazine. And this magazine was the most popular magazine in the whole world. And so everybody knew about Aida. Everybody, including the Japanese. So almost overnight, Gladys became the Japanese's number one enemy. And you will hear the rest of her story tomorrow when you come back to Mission.